if you decide to do something and you want to actually take an active stance on management, you've got a couple of choices. You could choose non-lethal management or you could choose lethal management. Now, non-lethal management is a group of practices that, as the name implies, you are not intending to kill an animal or kill any animal. You're essentially intending to either reduce or eliminate the problem using a management approach that does not kill the animal. And those approaches, as we'll talk about in just a minute, as you can see the suite of menu options here. Those approaches have a great amount of options. There's a couple of advantages to non-lethal management, and there's some disadvantages to non-lethal management. The advantages are that not everybody in society today is in favor of killing something, and so these options, because they're not killing the animal, they are very attractive and have a wider acceptance amongst a larger segment of the population because they're not killing something. So there's much more public tolerance for some of these non-lethal management options versus lethal management options. The other benefit to non-lethal management is in certain areas, and especially in areas where there's a higher density of humans, that lethal management may not be a legal, safe, or effective option. And so sometimes only non-lethal management is an available option for you simply because of legalities and safety. So those are the advantages. Non lethal management, however, has a couple of disadvantages that are rather large. One is, compared to lethal management options as a group of practices, non lethal management is typically more expensive to purchase each option and also to employ that option, relative again to lethal management option. The larger disadvantage, however, is non-lethal management is a little bit like a band-aid approach. You're not really solving the problem with any of these management options in the non-lethal category, but rather instead you're actually moving the damage and the problem someplace else, and most often that damage is being moved to the next nearest neighbor. So you have to be aware of that. All right, with that being said, here are your options for non-lethal management, starting with exclusion. And exclusion can be as logistically difficult and as expensive as the picture in the upper right-hand corner, that being a high-tensile woven wire deer fence. That fence is very difficult to install, it's expensive to purchase, but it's very, very effective if it's installed correctly, and it can be very effective for the next 30 years. So that's one example of exclusion. Another example of exclusion, however, that's not nearly as logistically difficult to implement or expensive is to, for example, use steel wool to plug a 1/2 inch hole that is in your eave or in your fascia board so that bats and other animals don't get into your attic. So anything exclusion means to exclude animals or to prevent animals from accessing an area where you typically don't want them to be. So it could be fencing, it could be caulking, it could be chicken wire or something along those lines. The next management option is harassment, and we've talked a little bit about this when we talked about the integrated wildlife damage management approach. But harassment, it has two different forms. One is noise harassment, where you're just making a loud noise to scare an animal out of the area or animals out of the area. Another is visual harassment. We've talked about the eye scare balloon. That's an example of visual harassment. Another example might be owl decoys that you see sometimes on tops of silos or other areas like that. And the idea behind that is owls are predators of other animals like small mammals and birds. And so the idea is to put this scary looking predator out and other animals will stay away from it. But as we've already identified, a lot of times, with especially visual harassment, animals habituate or get used to that scary looking thing. And once they habituate to it, it loses its effectiveness. So the better approach for harassment is to use both a noise and a visual harassment approach combined, and that gets back to that diversity of approach. So a good example of a harassment option that uses both noise and visual approach is a dog. So the animals see a dog, and then once the dog starts to bark, you've got a diversity of approach with harassment. Repellents are another option. Repellents come in two general categories. One is taste or contact, and one is area or odor repellents. Taste repellents are something similar to what the gentleman is doing with the backpack sprayer in the picture here, where you would spray a repellent onto vegetation that you want to protect. And once that repellent dries, if an animal goes and eats the repellent laced vegetation, it either does not taste good to the animal and or it makes the animal not feel well. So the animal might get diarrhea or have stomach cramps or vomit or something along those lines. And the idea behind a taste repellent is the animal ate something, it didn't feel well or it didn't taste good to the animal, and so it typically will stay away from that general area. Area repellents or also odor repellents are different. They repel simply by smell, or it's something that doesn't smell good to that animal. So a good example of an area repellent would be mothballs, for example, or hanging Irish Spring soap off of your apple trees. Generally, taste repellents are more effective than area repellents for a variety of reasons. However, be aware that even with the best taste repellent in scientific trials, that they have only stopped browsing on plants by up to 60%, which means that 40% of your plant is still getting browsed. So repellents are not an end-all be-all strategy, but they can be useful in certain situations. Trapping and relocating is the next management option, and this has got some issues involved with it, but generally trapping and relocating means that you're live trapping an animal, and once you've trapped the animal and the animal's still alive, you're going to relocate it someplace outside of the problem area. So a couple of issues with trapping and relocating. Legally in Wisconsin, if you trap an animal and you relocate it, that you can only release it on property that you either own yourself, or if you release it on private property you do not own, you must have that private property owner's permission. If you release it on public property, it is generally recommended that you have the permission of the public property manager. So as you can see, it's very, very difficult once you've trapped an animal to figure out a place to relocate this animal or release it. So that's a legal consequence. There's also a disease ramification or consideration here. So, for example, if you trap a skunk, which is a common carrier of rabies, and you trap a skunk in, let's say, Township A, and that skunk, unbeknownst to you, is rabid. So you take that rabid skunk from your township in Township A and you release it in Township B. You have legal permission to release it in Township B. And Township B does not have rabies until you release that skunk, and now all of a sudden you've introduced rabies into Township B. So you've spread disease simply by relocating the animal. So there's a consideration for that as well. And the final consideration for trapping and relocating is one that is a humane consideration. So many animals are territorial by nature, or they're territorial at different times of the year, most likely when they're breeding. So if you catch an animal that is within its home range and it's within its territory, and you relocate that animal, either territorial by nature or territorial by season, and you relocate that animal into another animal's territory, typically the animal that has been relocated is going to have a hard go of it because you've just relocated it into a hostile territory. So there are some considerations from a disease, legal, and humane standpoint, and typically what I'd recommend, if you trap an animal, if it's legal for you to do so, I would be prepared to kill the animal once you've trapped it. Habitat modification is another option to consider, and habitat modification is a thing where you would go in and you would modify the habitat in a way that would discourage the animal from being there. And this can be useful in certain situations, but I would be very careful about doing this. And if you were to modify the habitat in a negative way to discourage a problem animal from being in your area, I would do this on a very limited basis and see if it works first. And the reason I say that is most of the animals that we struggle with to manage and that we have conflicts with are generalists. And what that means is that these animals can range across a wide variety of habitats, and they also utilize a wide variety of food resources. So you may do everything correct to negatively modify that habitat, and the animal still may show up in your area simply because it's a generalist. In addition to that, not only have you modified the habitat in a negative way for the target animal that you're trying to discourage, but you've also modified the habitat in a negative way for a whole host of other animals that are not causing you problems, but you've just negatively affected their habitat. So be very, very careful if you do adopt habitat modification as a non-lethal management option. The last one we'll talk about is cultural modification. This may be the most difficult of all because we're asking humans to change their behavior. And I use the trash cans down in the lower left-hand picture as an example of this. So a lot of times you want to be careful and examine what you're doing that may be actually exacerbating the problem or creating the problem. So for example, if you're putting out trash cans and animals can get into your trash, then you may want to adopt a wildlife-proof trash can. Or for example, if you're feeding your pets outside, not only are you most likely feeding your pets, but you might also be feeding possum, skunk, raccoon, and a whole host of other animals that are being attracted to that food. So understand what you're doing to perhaps create the problem or cause the problem to be worse than it might be, and change your behavior to the extent that you can.